Good evening, everyone. I'm Erica Loam, the Peggy N. Gary Curatorial Associate at the Concord Museum. Thank you for joining us on this lovely spring evening for the museum's annual Lesneski Lecture. Founded in 1979, the Lesneski Lecture has welcomed nearly 4 dozen authors and historians to speak on topics ranging from herb gardens to early American furniture. The Guild of Volunteers has been an integral part of this annual program, which is named in honor of Mary Lesneski, who was a dedicated volunteer at the museum. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Glenn Adamson, author of the highly acclaimed book, Craft in American History. Glenn is a curator, writer, and historian based in New York, whose career and body of work has cemented him as one of our foremost experts on design, craft, and material culture. When I first read Glenn's bio, I came down with a massive case of professional envy and admiration. After receiving his PhD from Yale University, Glenn served as curator for the Chipstone Foundation before moving on to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as the head of research. He then became director of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City until 2016, and has since served as a senior scholar at the Yale Center for British Art, in addition to being an independent curator, writer, editor, interviewer, and everything in between. Glenn's impressive career serves as a model for any aspiring scholar or curator who seeks to work with and learn from objects. He's also the author of several books, including Thinking Through Craft, The Craft Reader, The Invention of Craft, and my favorite, Fewer Better Things, The Hidden Wisdom of Objects, which came out in 2018. If it wasn't evident in the titles I just read aloud, Glenn's abiding interest includes the history and theories of craft, the relationship between makers, objects, and society, and perhaps most important, how craft may be used to tell more inclusive and diverse stories. All of these topics can be found in Glenn's new book, Craft in American History, recently published by Bloomsbury Press. A welcome addition to the field, this book locates craft and craftspeople at the center of America's historic and ongoing struggles over freedom, labor, and culture. I can't wait to hear more about it from Glenn himself. And so without further ado, please welcome Glenn Adamson and our moderator, Concord Museum Director, Tom Putnam.
Thanks, Erica. A lovely introduction. Glenn, thank you for joining us. Another interesting distinction. I've only been here for 4 years, 3.5 years, and you're the only speaker to actually give both of our annual lectures. So we have the Lanigan Lecture in the fall and then the Lesneski Lecture in the spring. So we thank you for coming to join us. So since you, and I should note your twin brother from Stoneham, our local boys done good, I thought we might just start by having you explain, give a thumbnail sketch of how you moved from being our neighbor here in Massachusetts to this kind of esteemed position you have now, and really writing this book that provides this broad sweep in a 500-year survey of American craft.
Sure. It's great to be back with you, and obviously an honor to be in both fixtures in your annual lecture series. I will try to give a short account of myself, although I don't think I can possibly improve on Erica's introduction there, and I really appreciate it. So short version is that after graduating from Stoneham High School, just down the road from Concord, I think we mentioned last time I visited the museum that my mother was actually the chief of medicine at Winchester Hospital and the first woman to be so, one of the first women to be a doctor at that hospital, actually, and instilled me with a lifelong respect for women's expertise, which I hope we'll get back to in the discussion of the book. But then I went to Cornell for my undergraduate studies and Yale for my graduate work, and then ended up working for the Chipstone Foundation, as Erica mentioned, which is a really interesting organization out in Milwaukee that really fosters progressive scholarship in the field. And in fact, Erica has written for one of their publications, American Furniture. And then after 5 years in Milwaukee, mainly curating at the Art Museum there, I had the incredible opportunity to go to London and work at the Victoria and Albert Museum for 8 years, which, as people probably know, is, well, the official strapline is the world's greatest museum of art and design, which is essentially the case. So, hundreds of thousands of objects, hundreds of curators. I was lucky enough to be the head of research there, which was just a fantastic and eye-opening job, really incredible education for me. Then came back to New York, was 3 years the director of the Museum of Arts and Design there in Manhattan, and left that position in 2016 and have been basically an independent writer and curator since.
I heard you speak once before, and I loved a line that you said that your career has allowed you to involve yourself in the, quote, pageant of human creativity. I thought that was a lovely way of describing it. So the book is stitched together by scores of wonderful stories, and I want to get to those. But I just thought to lay the groundwork, could you speak a little bit on how you define the word craft, or what when you use that term, what is it that our viewers should be thinking of?
Yeah, I am often asked that question, and what I like to say is that I try to define it in a very common sense way, but then apply it very broadly. So a handy short definition would be skilled making at human scale, which I think most people can get behind as a way of describing what people mean by craft. But what you'll notice is that it doesn't necessarily tell you what's being crafted or why. And I think that's quite significant, because it leaves open the possibility that a fine artwork could be crafted, or something that's also engineered could be crafted, or like a design, say, or a bridge, a piece of architecture, possibly even some scientific and medical applications could involve aspects of craft. So each of those words is quite important: skilled making at human scale, especially the skilled human part. But that's the way I try to use it. So again, very common sense, very broad in its application.
Okay. So Allison, let's go ahead and put the first slide up, which will help get us into some of these stories. First one is just the cover of the book. So maybe you can explain why you chose these two images. And I think actually the second slide has the two images shown a little bit more broadly. So.
Well, everyone in the audience will probably recognize the image on the left. That, of course, is John Singleton Copley's portrait of Paul Revere a couple of years before the Revolution. And so I chose that one maybe for obvious reasons. He's arguably the most famous American craftsperson, with the possible exception of Betsy Ross. And not coincidentally, they're both revolutionary craftspeople. He was chosen, if you like, to go on the famous Midnight Ride because he was a trusted member of the community. And one of the key points of the book really is that when we lose touch with craft in our culture, we do, of course, lose the wonderful objects that craftspeople make, but we also lose the people themselves, the makers, who occupy this very central position, a position of responsibility, reliability, social cohesion in the midst of our communities. And I thought it was very interesting in that sense to juxtapose it with the image on the right, which is a quilt made in 1983 by a woman named Jessie Telfair, which was really motivated on her part by her experiences during the civil rights struggle. So she was, one of many women that were working in Alabama and elsewhere in the South that were directly involved with the civil rights movement, who were also quilters and were using their craft partly to make money for the cause and for their own families. And so this kind of ringing out freedom, freedom, freedom makes you think about the echoes with the revolutionaries of Revere's time. But of course, there's also a lot that separates these two individuals, not just 2 centuries, but also, of course, gender, race, arguably class, medium. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition to me. It suggests how much has changed over the course of craft history, but also how much has remained the same.
We should note we're continuing our tradition that for those of you who submit questions, we will randomly select one of you and send you a free copy of Glenn's book. And so we remind the audience to think of your questions. I'll get to them towards the end, but we want you to submit them along the way. Well, let's go back to Revere for a moment, and you've referenced Betsy Ross. So let's talk about the two of them. And can you also, in that, talk about why in kind of the American popular imagination, American craft is so identified with the revolutionary period.
Yeah, well, for good reason, because of course the Industrial Revolution happened at the same time as the American Revolution. So it's really in the late 18th century, although only gradually, that you begin to have machine production factory systems starting to displace artisans from the center of the economy. Arguably, that doesn't really, become a tidal wave until well into the 19th century. But you can start to see the effects in crafts like shoemaking, textiles, and in fact, even in Revere's own trade of metalwork. I think most people probably don't know that he eventually became a mass producer of sheet metal to, sheathe ships, for example, and also a maker of cannons. That's what he did after the Revolutionary War. And he by no means missed the days when he had a leather apron and was working with his hands. He wanted to get out of that shop and make more money, right? Mm-hmm. So he wanted to become an industrialist and an entrepreneur. There's a good reason there that craft is so identified with the colonial era and the revolutionary period. But of course, there's also a lot of nostalgia wrapped up in that, and probably some misperceptions about what that craft actually looked like before it started to be contrasted with industry. And so I've just mentioned that Revere, very much aspired to escape the condition of being an artisan. Betsy Ross, similarly, there she is in a kind of revivalist picture, obviously made well after the fact. And in fact, a very misleading one, because as far as researchers have been able to make out, Ross had little or nothing to do with the actual design or making of the first US flag. Sorry to burst the bubble. But as I say in the book, what really is impressive and fascinating about Ross is that she ended up running her own upholstery shop after her husband died early in her life, remarried a couple of times, but still ran the upholstery shop as a sole entrepreneur. And that was very, very unusual. And again, something that only widows tended to do, for a woman to have that entrepreneurial role. So I suppose another thing that I'm trying to correct constantly in the book is our tendency to look back at this era with rose-colored glasses, because often colonial craft is treated in a way that doesn't consider the reality of gender and particularly ethnic marginalization. And I really wanted to situate the stories of people like Revere, who maybe match people's mental image of what a colonial craftsperson looked like, with the reality, which of course included many Native American, African American, and female craftspeople that don't get picked up in those mainstream histories very often.
So let's move from one seamstress to another, and it's on this point that you just made. So I hope the next slide is of Elizabeth Keckley, and I wanted you to then tell us give us the story behind.
Yeah, so Ross and Revere are so famous, and in fact, there was a survey of high school students done in the 1970s that asked something like, name an American who wasn't a president, a historic American who wasn't a president, and they came in 1 and 2. So it gives you a sense of how famous, maybe not today, but very recently, as they were. Elizabeth Keckley, not so much, but she probably should be, because her story is even more remarkable than either of theirs. So she was born into slavery, experienced some of the terrible things that particularly female enslaved people did, terrible forms of abuse, but also managed to acquire the skills of dressmaking. And then through the cultivation of independent clients, which is actually work that she was doing to get money for the family that, quote, owned her, so not necessarily to make money directly, but she was able to cultivate a circle of, you might say, admirers who eventually helped her buy her own freedom. Then she came to Washington, D.C., and she amazingly ended up as the dressmaker to the elite women of the city. And the amazing part is that she made dresses not only for Mrs. Lincoln, Mary Todd Lincoln, and ultimately ended up living in the White House during the Civil War with the Lincolns, but also made dresses for the wives of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. So her couture, you might call it, was actually being worn by the great ladies of the Civil War on both sides of the conflict. And we know all of this because she wrote an autobiography that was published after the war, sort of memoir of her time with the Lincolns, which was very controversial at the time, not only because she was a Black woman, but because she was revealing the personal lives of the presidential family in a very unprecedented way. So an altogether astounding person who really, transformed her life utterly through the work of her own hands and her own skill and design sensibility.
I'm going to stop the slideshow for just a minute. I want to, there's a connection here with Frederick Douglass, but before we get to him, since we have a Concord-centered audience, I'm going to try to do this somewhat sequentially. You talk about Longfellow, Emerson, and Thoreau in the book, and I thought I'd give you a chance here to explain why those three men show up in the book and kind of what they represent in this history.
Yeah, so briefly, the Transcendentalists show up in the book because, frankly, they had a profound interest in craft. And I think everybody knows that about Thoreau, but it was true of Emerson and Longfellow as well. Maybe people know Longfellow's famous poem about the blacksmith, standing under the chestnut tree, he owes not any man, and all that. So that's a great example of 19th century romanticism attaching itself to the craftsperson. Mm-hmm. It is just very interesting. It's like a seesaw, as the artisan becomes less central to the economy, he or she becomes more central to the symbolic ideal that Americans have of themselves. And that poem is a really important milestone for me in that process. Emerson also wrote on the subject. He wrote an incredible text called Doctrine of the Hands that's well worth reading, that sort of veers in the same direction, independence, sort of reliability. He was one of those intellectuals who kind of distrusted intellectualism, and he used the plain speakingness of the artisan as a kind of model to follow in his own work and thinking. And then, of course, the great example would be Thoreau, who, I think I talked about this last time I was in speaking at the Concord Museum, but he was not as independent as he claimed. He could walk through the woods to his mom's house, but he did build his cabin with his own hands, and he did try to furnish his life with everything that he needed in a very kind of craft-based ethos, and of course became very, very important. Not initially, initially Walden was not a bestseller, but by the 1960s, it was really taken up as an absolute, a pole star for people to steer towards. And particularly in the context of the counterculture, you actually had communes that were called New Walden, and you had people reading Thoreau avidly and modeling themselves after that. So that sort of back to the land dropout culture really looked back to him as a model.
I love this quote from Emerson. It's in the book. He wrote, "A man is no worse a metaphysician for knowing how to drive a nail home without splitting the board." And that, as you just said, you describe Walden as a foundational text on American craft. But there's also a little bit of a protest in Walden that we may want to go back to towards the end, but maybe you can comment on that.
Well, I think that was another reason the counterculture was interested in him, because there was an at times implicit and at times extremely strongly stated critique of what we might now call capitalism. He didn't really frame it in that way, but he saw the mass-produced objects of his own day as tawdry and lamentable, really. And he thought that by detaching himself from that world of goods, he could achieve something that was more authentic, more honest, more worthy, really. And it's just worth stressing how early that is, because when we think of objects from the 1840s, we don't think of them as cheap, mass-produced junk. I think of them as valuable antiques to put in our museums, including the Concord Museum. So it shows that this idea that we have, rightly or wrongly, about mass production as debasing our material worlds is a very old idea, and the craft has been put in opposition to it really from the get-go.
Again, another quote from the book. You write, "And Walden, later generations would discover a new way to think about craft, an expression of individualism, not in the service of modern society, but in opposition to it."
Yeah, exactly.
We'll go back to the slides now, and Frederick Douglass, who was a visitor to Concord, plays a role in your tale. I think somewhat relates to this slide, not exactly, but anyway, tell us what Douglass said in the quote that you really drive home in the book.
Yeah, the quote is that Negroes, the word that he used, but which we wouldn't now, but he used the word Negroes and said Negroes must learn trades or die. The implication there being that particularly he's thinking about enslaved people, and of course that was him when he was younger. He was born into slavery and escaped by virtue of being a ship's caulker on the Baltimore docks, which gave him just enough freedom of movement to effect his escape from bondage. But regardless of the question of escape, he also saw clearly that if you were enslaved, then having a marketable skill was really the best way to stay out of the fields, which of course were killing fields, right, as we all know. You're very, very likely to die at a young age, and miserably so as well. And that happened to millions of people in America. And African Americans who were able, whether free or enslaved, to find a skill, find a way to train themselves or get training, were much more likely to have a longer life expectancy, maybe even keep their families together if they were free, than actually become middle class. And there's many examples of that I tell in the book. These images are from a slightly later point, after the Civil War, when Booker T. Washington starts to become the nation's leading advocate for vocational education for young Black people. And it's really a similar ideal that he's propagating, very gendered, as you can see here. The women are doing textile processing, the men are doing woodwork, literally building the school that they're going to study in. And he later becomes a kind of object of critique by other Black intellectuals, most famously W.E.B. Du Bois, who sees this idea of manual education as essentially destining younger Black people to a life of working class occupation instead of what he might have seen as higher aspirations. But that juxtaposition can be overdrawn, because they were really both exploring different ways of advancing the cause of what they would have seen as the Black race. And craft plays a big part in that story, as it did for Douglass.
Right. And again, just this notion of empowerment, what I took from those chapters, how craft can be empowering to individuals.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, Du Bois would also say it can be an entrapment, as well as a form of empowerment. So this is where it gets subtle and interesting and complicated. But I think even Du Bois would have recognized that, as a sociologist, because he studied, occupations very extensively, he would have recognized that skilled tradespeople were an absolute spine of the Black emergent middle class. So, there was a very sophisticated understanding of these issues in the Black intellectual climate of the late 19th and early 20th century. And, these debates come down to the present day. How much should we be funding vocational education in cities, for example, in America today? And there are not really any easy answers to that, but certainly craft has some part to play.
And then, connecting these women who are making textiles with cotton. Let's go to the next slide, which I think is from Lowell.
There you go. Yeah.
Tell us more why you included this in the book.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other side of it, because this, of course, is the factory system, which was more highly developed in Lowell than anywhere else by the 1820s, 30s, and in fact had the first experience of industrial action that was led by female strikers, loom operatives like the ones that you see on the right there. And I guess the thing to emphasize here is just how dreadful it was to work in an early factory. Incredibly long hours, very loud, somewhat dangerous, not textiles so much, but other industries like, iron forges, for example, incredibly dangerous. Yet people flocked to work for them because it was more reliable income than farm work. We shouldn't underestimate how difficult it was to work on a farm, right? So we shouldn't compare it perhaps to a livelihood that we might be more familiar with today. It was a lot of bad options for people that weren't born to wealth in those days. But certainly there's a very, very strong sense already by this time that craft is being eliminated by the efficiency of this kind of production system. Now, maybe the last thing to say about this image is that, of course, we think of it when we first see it as the opposite of craft. But of course, much of what you're looking at in this image was handcrafted, right? The machines, the building, even the clothes that the women are wearing would have all been handmade. The question is on what terms. So you start to think about, semi-skilled workforces and the exploitation of journeymen and other artisans. So it's not just that machines come in and craftspeople go out, it's also that craftspeople lose their economic leverage, and skill starts to become more attenuated during this period. So again, a little bit of a complicated story, but it's for sure the case that the factory system could never have existed if artisans hadn't been there to make it happen.
So this may seem a little out of order, but I wanted you to talk about Native peoples, indigenous art, and explain why kind of sequentially in some ways it does make sense to feature this particular artist here.
Yeah, I mean, you can pick up the story anywhere because obviously Native artisans were here before anybody else,
right,
and had a craft-based economy, if you could put it that way, for centuries or even millennia before settlement. This image is particularly striking because what it looks like and what it actually is are so different. So when you first see it, you think traditional artisan with his wares, and perhaps this kind of jewelry has been made for centuries, who knows. And indeed, that was the rhetoric that would have surrounded the picture when it was taken in the 1870s or 80s. But in fact, what you're looking at is an artisan whose name has come down to us as Slender Maker of Silver, by the way. An artisan who's showing concho belts and other goods that were specifically designed for the colonial clientele in the Southwest in America, which of course is mixed Mexican, Spanish, indigenous, and white. And the native people in that region developed a style of jewelry making and other metalwork that was specifically attuned to that potential audience. This picture, in fact, was probably taken at a US military base, which explains why somebody had a camera, because there was a big institutional framework in which that could have happened. And in fact, it's a fake backdrop. So the cactus, the blanket over the table, the painted background, that's all sort of typical photographers' props of the era. So it's a fascinating image to me because at first you see it as, so authentic and incredible sort of gaze of this man making contact with you. It just feels beyond genuine into something much deeper and more profound. But actually what you're looking at is adaptation and invention on the part of the native people trying to figure out a way to not just acquire skills and use them, but also get some kind of purchase on a livelihood in this very turbulent and very violent situation. Essentially, they're at the tail end of a process of genocide here and displacement. So this is the result.
And let's go to the next slide. But that's a theme throughout the book, really, is craft is always adapting to its times. I mean, it doesn't exist, kind of in its own bubble. Maybe you can explain these images, which are similar in that regard.
Yeah, I'd like to juxtapose these two images because, again, they occupy sort of different sides of this same question of appearances and reality. So the one on the left was made by a silversmith called Robert Jarvie, and it's an imitation of an Anasazi pot, ceramic pot, but made in silver for this weird organization in Chicago called the Cliff Dwellers Club. And they called themselves that partly because they were on the top floor within a skyscraper, which I think was 11 stories. But Chicago is famous for these early high-rise buildings. But the term Cliff Dwellers is an allusion to the Anasazi or Pueblo peoples of the Southwest. So this is a sort of straightforward case of white culture appropriating native culture. And then on the right, you have a pot that is made of ceramic by Julian and Maria Martinez. And you might describe, again, it seems so authentic and richly so. And in a way it is, but it's also a funny example of what I might call self-appropriation. So their story, Maria and Julian Martinez, husband and wife team, is that they were working with white archaeologists to dig up shards of ancient Pueblo pots And then they adapted what they found on those shards to these modern vessels that, not coincidentally, fit right into the prevailing Art Deco taste of the time. So we're in the 1920s here. So this black on black palette and the sort of reduced or abstracted motifs do have some precedent in historic work, but they're also very cleverly adapted for a modern market. So in both images, you see the kind of shifting sands of craft being used and deployed in an intelligent way by makers, but also in a way that sort of departs from its historic precedent while simultaneously insisting on the importance of tradition.
Let's see the next slide, be sure that I know it's the right one. Yeah. So I found this story of Petrosino Varela fascinating. Maybe you can explain it to us.
Yeah, and this is a very similar story, although he's slightly different ethnic trajectory here because he's Latino, a sort of mestizo Latin American man who was adopted, if I could put it that way, by the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s as a representative figure of vernacular genius, might be a good way of putting it. So he made these santos, so saint figures, carvings out of wood, like the one that you see on the right. And they were taken up through the lens of this modern taste, like a lot of other folk art at the time. People might be aware of Abby Aldrich Rockefeller's activity, setting up a museum at Williamsburg. Of course, her husband was John D. Rockefeller, who was on the board of MoMA. So it was a very close group of elites driving all this activity. But it's fascinating because Varela, could not have had a more precarious or marginalized existence. He was an itinerant farmhand, basically, going from job to job as seasons dictated. Limited literacy probably, but just had the wherewithal to acquire these carving skills and then make these quite extraordinary and moving objects that told narratives of his own devising. And the reason I was fascinated by the story, and probably you feel the same, is that it's such a fascinating case of different perspectives converging on the same objects. Because what Varela thinks of them, to the extent that we can even recover that, and what these curators and collectors in New York think of them is so different, and yet they both obviously instill the objects with such value. It's a great example of how craft serves this kind of rotating lens and meeting place between different people, different backgrounds.
We have our first two questions, which I'll go to in a moment, so please keep them coming. Let's go to the next slide, which I think relates to this story. Maybe you can tell us.
Well, this is Eileen Osborne Vanderbilt Webb, who, from a certain point of view, she's the most important person in the story. If what you think is important is the symbolic capital of craft and the idea of a craft movement, because she founded the post-war American studio craft movement. And when I say that, what she did was to found the American Craft Council, as it is now called today, and everything associated with it. So a museum that I used to direct, a magazine, a store, annual conferences, a World Craft Council with its own annual conferences, on and on and on, successfully all the way across the board. As you can maybe tell from her name, Eileen Vanderbilt Webb, she was absolutely of the top drawer patrician class in New York, very close friends with the people running MoMA, so very connected to the Patrocino Varela story. And in fact, the museum that she founded, which was originally the Museum of Crafts and Design, was right next door to MoMA and could in some ways be seen as a kind of self-appointed craft outpost of its larger neighbor. And under her patronage, the post-war craft movement thrived and generated all of these fantastic people who you see in museums today, many of whom were motivated more artistically than she was. She was really interested in livelihoods and sort of good design. And what happened instead was that a sort of abstract expressionism came along and motivated a lot of craftspeople to totally reinvent their mediums in ways that she found actually a little perplexing. But, good for her. She sort of followed the craftspeople where they led her and was never anything but unflagging in her support. Great woman. And, if there's anybody out there who's a patron of the Concord Museum, I would advise you to think on her works and do likewise. She was the best of all possible patrons, really.
Thank you for the plug. Let's just I'll go through the next couple slides. I'll just let you tell us, Glenn, why you chose them.
Well, this is a fascinating comparison, right? Rosa Parks and Eileen Osborne Vanderbilt Webb, because you don't normally think of these two people as inhabiting the same universe, much less the same storyline. But Rosa Parks was a craftswoman. You know, when she wouldn't give up her seat on the bus in the famous Montgomery boycott, she was on her way home from her job as a seamstress at a department store. That's why she was tired, because she'd been sewing all day. And it turns out, I was amazed to learn this, I have to say. I only found out when I was researching the book. But she was actually radicalized, if I could put it that way, at a craft school. So she was attending, we might call them maybe consciousness raising sessions, not a term they would have used in the mid 50s, but you know, these sessions that were run at a place called the Highlander Craft School that had been founded in the 1930s as one of these revival craft places, like Penland, if people know about that, or John C. Campbell Craft School. And this place had sort of become politicized. And she went down there, and that's how she got connected to a lot of her future colleagues in the civil rights movement. And she was chosen as a kind of respectable figure to be the, you know, the leader effectively of the boycott. So it's a story that's completely wrapped up with craft. And in fact, there's a lot of other connections that are very interesting between the civil rights movement and the labor movement of that same time. Again, not a story that I think a lot of Americans are that aware of now. And in fact, most craft history scarcely mentions the history of organized labor, which again is kind of crazy if you think about it, because that's how organized labor thinks of itself in terms of hierarchies of skill. So a lot of connections here that I was trying to draw that you wouldn't normally find in a book about craft, perhaps.
Go to the next slide.
Yeah, so just thinking again about the importance of African Americans in the post-war story. Here are some that we would find in museums, or two people we would find in museums and in books about craft as an artistic pursuit. So it's on the right, Doyle Lane, the Los Angeles potter, and on the left, the very aptly named Art Smith, who was a jeweler in New York City. Both of them very much taking on modernist aesthetics in their respective mediums. It is maybe just worth pointing out that in the post-war period, you know, the more authorized disciplines of painting, sculpture, and architecture were all but closed to African Americans. There are some exceptions for sure. Sam Gilliam, the painter, for example, springs to mind. But, you know, very, very difficult for women or for anyone but white men really to enter those professions. And craft was something of an exception there. And again, especially for women, it was a very gender balanced world, especially weaving and metalwork and pottery. And so it's really worth remembering that, you know, now we're so attuned to these questions of diversity and inclusion, but craft has been way ahead of the game as far as that goes for a long time.
I think we have two more slides. Let's go to the next.
Yeah, so just kind of in the same vein, Faith Ringgold, I guess an artist that many people will know, if not as a fine artist and a book author, perhaps because of her very well-loved children's books. But she's a kind of presiding saint of Harlem, you might say. And again, an artist who was completely motivated by and fueled by craft, has been throughout her career. Another thing maybe to say about Ringgold is that she was very deeply involved in the feminist art movement. And, you know, she's one of a whole group of other artists, not only women, by the way, also men, but artists who were recovering craft traditions as a valid means of expression, sort of departing from the macho, you know, swaggering abstraction, color field painting of that time, and offering an alternative that tapped into these traditions. And Ringgold is a fantastic example of that, obviously here looking at the history of Southern quilting, especially. And it makes you think about that Jessie Telfair freedom quilt that we started from, and this sort of different position that Ringgold's taking here as a fine artist, but very much drawing on some of the same you know, cultural materials.
And this last image kind of flips craft on its head. Tell us what.
Yeah, exactly. It's such a nice segue from Ringgold to This is a nice thing about doing it this way because you don't have to read the 50 or 60 pages in between. It seems much more of a natural transition. But this is a work by Sonia Clark, who you actually see there on the right from behind. And it's a piece simply called Unraveling. Very courageous project. What she does is to go into museums and hang a commercially bought Confederate flag from the wall, so-called Stars and Bars battle flag, and invites members of the public to stand next to her and unravel it. And you can imagine what this might have been like to do. Let's say in a museum in the American South, don't know who's going to come in the door. Yes, it's in an art museum, but still very exposing and, as I say, very courageous thing to do. And she tells wonderful stories about the experiences that she has doing this and the conversations that she has. So as you say, it's like turning craft on its head or upside down because it's unmaking rather than making, but it's still handwork and it's still interaction with material. And one of the things that people will always say to her, as you know, you're unpicking this great symbol of American racism and prejudice and violence, right? And one of the things that people will always say to her is, boy, this is really difficult, meaning taking the threads out of this tightly woven flag. And Sonia always says, I know, isn't it? So it's a perfectly chosen metaphor, really. And I ended the book with her work partly because it shows how much of the collective cultural endeavor that I think we're all obligated to take on at this point, especially with regard to the diversity of American culture, has to do not only with crafts history, but the way that we tell it and the strands that we pick out of it and the strands that we hold on to.
All right, so let's turn to some questions from the audience.
Yeah, great.
And I'll just kind of read them as they came in. One of the ideas that influenced colonial America was that farmers was self-governing for their work, making them able to govern their communities. How were craftspeople viewed for their governing skills?
Yeah, great question. So this inevitably makes you think about the opposition between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, because what the questioner is describing is essentially Jeffersonian democracy. So the idea that you have a yeoman class of independent farmers who are sort of operating at the right political scale, if you will, from Jefferson's point of view, whereas Hamilton is an advocate of centralization and therefore industrialization, who puts the government into the position of funding large industrial projects and also things like canals. And so there you have a real clash of what America is going to be. I suppose you could broadly say that it's also a North-South clash, which comes ultimately to be tested during the Civil War, which is not only a fight between a slave power and a free nation, but also a contest between two different types of economy, one of which is Jeffersonian and the other one is Hamiltonian, broadly speaking. But that opposition very, very much implies that craft is on the Jefferson side. So the idea of the independent, often rural, certainly small scale producer is going to be freighted with that whole ideology. And it's very interesting to see how that plays itself out over the course of American history after even today. I mean, you can even see in the echoes of Trump's rhetoric about coal miners. That's in some ways a very strongly Jeffersonian. We don't usually give it that kind of credit because it just seems kind of superficial. He's actually tapping into something very deep in American political history there.
Okay, some people made things out of necessity and some made things for sale. Could you talk about the creativity that came into play?
Yeah, another really good question and entirely accurate. And in fact, of course, sometimes it's the same people. So I think it's often underestimated how much rural craftspeople were making objects for sale outside their farmsteads. And there was a very impressively extended and robust trade network that penetrated quite deep into the American interior, if I could put it that way. Certainly places like Concord or anywhere in New England, unless you went really far north, you would have very active trade and artisanal participation in that trade. So it's really a very mixed economy, even on the level of each individual craftsperson. It's also just worth noting that, the trade was in every kind of thing, even gravestones. I was amazed to discover this again when doing research for my book. Gravestones that were carved in the Boston area were sold, traded all the way down the eastern seaboard and even down to the Caribbean because of the skills of the stone workers there. So, transport was not as much of an impediment as we might think, and it wasn't a matter of isolated craftspeople just making what they needed. It was very connected, early American craft economies.
So I'm assuming this is also in the Revolutionary period. How many of those the trades were also farmers, and how did this differ between urban and rural communities?
Well, no, I mean, the questioner has it exactly. If you were not urban, you were probably involved in farming, at least to some extent, if not wide scale field propagation, certainly garden scale farming. Whereas in a city, you were probably not, except at very small scales. People did keep pigs in cities. Right. There was a certain amount of like agriculture going on in places like Boston in the 18th century for sure. But you have a very, very strong divide. Not necessarily in terms of the objects that people were making, because the rural things could be quite sophisticated and very informed by city tastes. And let's not forget that American city tastes were very informed by European precedents, especially British precedents. And indeed, all these craftspeople think of themselves as British or other immigrant groups before the revolution anyway. So there's, again, a lot of continuity there. But craft in a rural context is very much carried out against the backdrop of husbandry, as they might have called it then.
Okay, so these are two questions that bring us closer to our own time. Why is it that craft artists, even the most famous, always seem to earn less or sell for less compared to painters and ceramics as well, and in general?
Well, maybe I'll first answer another question. It's not so much about fine art, which is why are craftspeople always so broke? The fundamental question there. And of course, the reason is we haven't really dwelled on this, but it's sort of implied by the factory versus artisan opposition. Craft is not efficient. Otherwise, you wouldn't need to build factories. So almost always craftspeople are going to price themselves out of any popular market or democratic market. So that means they need to find other routes to make a living, which could go in the direction of fine arts, like selling through galleries. It could go in the direction of luxury trades, which the French and Italians do much better than Americans, but we have some experience of that. And then you have these more folkish or vernacular or sometimes touristic economies like the ones we were talking about with Native Americans. So that's the backdrop for the question. Now, when you get to the fine art context, of course, there's the additional issue of the simple hierarchy of the disciplines. And I think this is lessening and lessening as time goes on. But certainly, I think it's still the case that the structural sexism and racism that resulted in these trades being put in the hierarchy that they're in the first place, in other words, textiles at the bottom and painting at the top, that's really much more a result of the fact that the white elite men were doing the painting and people in India were doing the weaving in the 17th and 18th centuries, not the other way around. So I think it's very important to denaturalize our ideas about this. And as I often say, the question is not why are crafts compensated less than fine arts? The question should be, why did something get to be called craft in the first place, whereas others don't? Because it seems to me blindingly obvious that textiles is a perfectly adequate medium for self-expression and conceptual exploration. And conversely, painting is obviously very skill intensive and has a lot of crafts aspects to it. So the whole idea that these things are sort of intrinsically different and should be positioned on a hierarchy has always seemed like complete nonsense to me.
Today's crafters seem to be either artists creating art or custom furnishings, and what might you call hobby crafters? I've always wished that artisanal creators could assure themselves of a good income by being integrated into the economy of the necessities. Can you foresee this for today's workers?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is yes. And in fact, if people are interested, I wrote an essay for the Smithsonian Magazine for their January issue that was almost like an extra chapter of the book in a way, that looked at the small scale craft economy, which fascinatingly to me, because you would think of craft and the digital as being kind of opposed to one another, but actually the most decisive factor in instigating the craft economy in recent years has in fact been the internet and things like Instagram, because it allows people to sell directly to a clientele, a customer base that's very widespread. So it means you can be very specialized and make, handmade beer glasses that are specific to particular kinds of IPA and sell to people all over the country and make sell as many as you can make.
Right.
So there's reason for optimism there. I just wanted to say also that the questioner is absolutely right to note hobbyism as an important aspect of the story. We haven't had time to get into it, but the book has a lot of stories about everything from post-war hot rodding to Martha Stewart and the way that she managed ideas of amateur craft in the building of her empire. And it is worth noting that if you were just to ask the question, where is the real money in craft, you'd come up with the answer, Michael's Superstore or Martha Stewart Living, right? That's where the actual craft capital resides. We don't tend to think of it that way because we think through a museum point of view, but it's really in hobbyism that the real that craft really lives on as a valid economy.
How do you view Shaker's combination of beauty and function?
Ooh, nice. Yeah, I did talk about the Shakers in the book, and boy, the Shakers. It's such a moving story with some unsettling elements as well. But you have to think of these people as having been led to believe by their founder, Mother Ann Lee, to think that the world was actually ending. Right? They went out in the field and expected to have the rapture, and then of course it didn't happen. And they had to cope with that somehow and maybe do the math again, But ultimately they settle into this extremely successful, both aesthetically and economically speaking, very successful way of life, not just them, but also other sectarians like the Oneida Perfectionists, for example, or the Amana community that I talked about in the book. And they, in some ways, achieve the most holistic and balanced relationship between craft and small-scale village community of anybody in the whole story that I tell. In lots of ways, they would have been the envy of the arts and crafts reformers, for example. But they're driven by this very powerful sense of religion that gives them the cohesion to do that. So it's all sort of founded on what we would consider perhaps a mythology. That's very, I find it quite haunting, really, those stories. Not just the objects, which are remarkable and austere and beautiful, but also the interior mental lives of these people. I talk about one of them in the book. Isaac Youngs is his name. He's, extremely perfectionist. He's a Shaker, not a perfectionist. Sorry, he's not literally a perfectionist, capital P, but he just won't give himself a break about anything, and struggles with his enforced celibacy. And it's absolutely amazing to read about him and think about what the objects that he made, which have this sort of unearthly quality of refinement and precision, just doesn't seem possible that it could have been made by human hands. And the mentality that produced those objects is really powerful.
Okay, one more question from the audience, and then I want to go to the conclusion of the book for our last couple minutes. So this is a question about Aileen Webb. Given Webb's deep connections to MoMA, was it her decision to keep craft in an outpost museum, or did she think about integration of craft within MoMA's collections?
Yeah, that's a nice specific question. I love it. So I thought the question was going to say, given Webb's deep pockets, which of course is another important part of the story, but no. So one thing to say is that, of course, MoMA did have a design program through the 50s that was very, very active and included a lot of people that we would consider to be craftspeople, weavers especially. They were super interested in textiles, but also furniture makers like George Nakashima, wood turners like James Crostini, potters like the Natzlers. They're all in the collection. You can go on their website if you want to look it up. So during the formative period in the years leading up to the formation of the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in 1956, MoMA was actually doing a lot of that work. And I think what Webb would have thought was that it was only a small narrative within MoMA's overall story. And she wanted to really create a showcase and platform for craftspeople. But she would have expected the two institutions to be really telling two sides of the same story. Maybe MoMA coming a bit more from the design side, and that her museum coming more from the perspective of the individual maker. But she would have thought of it as very compatible. And then what happens ultimately, not to go too deep into this, is that when the kind of radical break happens in the craft movement with people like Peter Voulkos and ceramics or Martani and textiles making really vivid expressionist sculpture, MoMA's not really interested. Fitfully, maybe a little bit of a dalliance with fiber art in the late 60s, but it doesn't really last because of these hierarchical issues that we've been talking about. But Voulkos has a show at MoMA in the late 50s. It takes a while for that to diverge.
So I thought we'd conclude with the question that you asked in the last chapter, which is, can craft save America? So what do you mean by the question, and what's your conclusion?
Yeah, it's kind of a playful thing in some ways. Sounds very serious. Can craft save America? And maybe the listeners are thinking, well, no, probably not. but I was taken by the question. I actually saw it written on a board. That was it was an exercise that some students at Warren Wilson College in this brand new master's degree course on craft studies, they were asked to come up with 100 questions about craft. And that was one of them. And I just saw it on the board and thought, that's brilliant. Can craft save America? Save America from what? And how? And I thought it was very provocative. I still do. And, given what's happened since I wrote the book, the pandemic, all the political upheaval and distress of the past year, I think it has felt like a parlous and perilous time. And craft does seem to me to offer, if not a solution to all of our problems, because nothing does, it has been strikingly important in the response to the coronavirus pandemic. People making both their own handmade masks and also, maker spaces, making protective gear for local hospitals. That's been happening. So on a practical level, it still comes in handy in an emergency. Maybe more importantly still, I think, as I said at the very beginning in reference to Paul Revere, craftspeople do serve as the kind of stable center of our communities. And insofar as they're coming back and we're going through a new craft revival, which I believe we are, again, partly digitally fueled, I think we're maybe regaining that sense of trusted kind of, I don't know, almost like a skeleton that we can hang the rest of our culture on. I think it really, really is important for a spine, and I think in that way, craft can be a lot more important and a lot more helpful than people think. So that's why I wanted to frame it in that way at the conclusion of the book.
But going back to a point we made earlier, you also talk about it plays a role in protest movements.
Yeah, that's true too. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there because, on the one hand, craft is the kind of universal. People on all sides of the political spectrum tend to embrace it. I think it's hard to imagine finding anyone in America who would turn their nose up at craft per se, or look at a really good craftsperson and say, oh, who cares? I mean, it's inherently mesmerizing and it prompts respect, no matter who you are. Of course, for that very reason, it is very useful in a protest context because, I mean, to put it bluntly, if you're going to march down the street shouting something, if you spent all night making something hold up in your hands, it's going to show you really care. It's like a way of showing your commitment. And again, ever since the revolution, the Boston Tea Party was essentially entirely the work of artisans. Those were Japanners and silversmiths and coopers that were chucking the tea out into the harbor. And ever since, craftspeople have been on the front lines of, protesting both on their own behalf and more general political issues. And, I think there's something there that's really healthy, that craft is bound up both in our shared sort of non-problematic identity as Americans and that we can all embrace and affirm. And it's also a tool of change. And the fact that it's both of those things at the same time is perhaps the most important thing about it.
I thought I'd end with words from the book.
Yeah.
Craft's connection to livelihood, pride, and everyday experience may help us during a time of unusually fierce political conflict to cross ideological boundaries that otherwise seem impregnable. Craft may regain its place at the nation's center rather than on our warring flanks. Craft is not just about striving for perfection, but also about making a reasonable peace with what's possible. So can craft save America? Maybe so, if we can get behind this idea, if we can all get behind this idea, our shared past is what the future will be made from, the best what we can. So, Glenn Adamson, thank you so much for joining us. We will again urge people to get the book, and really it's a wonderful and fascinating read, and really a whole different take on craft and its kind of central role in our nation's history. So thank you, Glenn, for joining us.
It's really great to speak with you.